You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And in today's discussion, we're going to discuss the economic and geopolitical positions of the two major U.S. presidential candidates. Joining me today in the discussion is David K. Young, the president of the Committee for Economic Development, which is the Public Policy Center of the Conference Board. David, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Very good to be here.
So, David, CED just recently published a backgrounder on the policy of the presidential candidates and their position on taxes, on tariffs, on trade and the border and all those kinds of things. We're going to run through, a bunch of this, and so we'll, obviously we'll be brief on each one. But let's talk about former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris and where they stand on any of the issues. So let's start with taxes. Maybe you could just do a run through of their positions, first on individual and then on corporate taxes.
Sure. And just to set the scene here as well, I think that it's important just to recognize that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expire after 2025. So this will be one of the most important, most pressing issues in the year ahead. But with regards to individual taxes, corporate taxes, and then other tax bills, from Trump's perspective, he'll make expiring changes from the 2017 tax law permanent. With regards to Harris, she's indicated no tax increases on any taxpayer making less than $400,000. With regards to corporate tax, Trump is looking to reduce corporate income tax rate to 20%. Harris looking to increase corporate income tax towards 28%. Neither candidate has said exactly how they'll go about implementing these tax law changes and specifically how they will pay for them. I think what's also important here, taxes obviously don't work in isolation, Steve, as you know. The US fiscal health situation is concerning. We have a ballooning deficit. Both individuals are looking to increase that deficit moving forward, which from the Committee for Economic Development's perspective raises some significant red flags as to the fiscal health of the United States moving forward.
Yeah, and David, I should have pointed out, and for our listeners, you probably know this, but the Conference Board and CED, or Public Policy Center, is entirely nonpartisan. So if you hear anything that suggests that we're campaigning for or against one candidate or another, then you're hearing it wrong. We're trying to just share what they have said their policies are, but we do have an opinion then on the impact of that to the economy, and so that's where you'll hear some of this analysis as Davey has just shared. So from an individual standpoint, very different, and also corporate tax point, very different. Generally, that will then have varying degrees of impact on the economy, Davey, if one gets in versus the other gets in.
Yeah, they have very different methods and strategies that they're looking to deploy, and how that will potentially not just impact individuals and corporations looking to do business, but then issues beyond this. So we're looking at issues such as regulation, tariffs, trade, and then also the US's role internationally with regards to other countries around the world. So looking at this correlation and connectiveness between domestic economics and how that plays out on the geopolitical landscape.
So you mentioned regulation. Let's talk about that, because for our, our member companies, regulation is critically important. They need to know what the rules are in order to run their businesses and, and operate. Talk about the regulation differences between the two candidates.
Yeah, I think this probably is one of the starker differences between both candidates. With regards to Trump returning to significant deregulation, he's always been more in favor of this, looking at most Biden-era environmental and labor regulations being repealed. Harris, on the other side, will push for greater regulation, but there is an impact here of the Loper Bright Enterprises decision, which severely restricts some of these initiatives that she'll be pushing forward. But I think as you look at all the issues that these two candidates are trying to differentiate themselves with, regulation is one of the more binary areas and differences between both candidates moving forward.
Yeah, and I think regulation takes on a lot of different flavors. One area is mergers and acquisitions, where you've got to believe that if you take them exactly what they say, that Harris is going to be more restrictive than Trump on mergers and acquisitions, which precisely follows what the Biden administration has been doing, even though she has said that she would replace not only the head of the FTC, but also the head of the SEC and potentially other regulators as well. But I think the philosophy should be a continuation, wouldn't you think?
Yeah. I think for a lot of these things also with Harris, there's somewhat of a continuation from the Biden-Harris era. I think you're seeing this both, you've seen it in their campaigns, you've seen it in the debates. How can she continue some of the policies from the Biden-Harris era, but also make some differences to kind of separate herself from what's happened in the last 3.5 years or so?
Now, one area that they both seem to be, actually more aligned is on tariffs, where, they both have promised to put more tariffs on, protect U.S. industry. Talk about that.
Yeah. So tariffs are, it's an interesting topic actually, and actually one that leads into the geopolitical realm of this conversation. So let me just say a couple of words on the tariffs, and then maybe just open it up for a slightly broader commentary from myself, Steve, on what's happening kind of just internationally. With regards to tariffs, Steve, both are in favor of looking at how best to implement tariffs. You've got Trump looking at slightly stronger tariffs. He's proposed universal tariffs starting at 10%, moving up to 20%. And then these tariffs get a lot stronger on Chinese goods. 60% or more is the number that has been mentioned from the Trump camp. Harris would broadly continue the administration's trade policies, including its current tariffs on China. She strongly opposes universal tariffs and discriminatory tariffs. The administration has escalated certain Trump-imposed tariffs on China, including 100% tariffs on electric vehicles and tariffs on steel and aluminium from Mexico, where most of the content is Chinese rather than Mexican. She's attacked Trump's trade policy in 2019, saying it is trade policy by tweet, and now calls the proposed tariffs a 20% sales tax on everyday products and basic necessities. I think what is also interesting here with regards to tariffs is the ramifications and the knock-on effects that tariffs could have on the US economy, especially when you start looking at the inflationary repercussions that could result.
Well, so you said something interesting there, and you have to differentiate what was said by the candidate before she was a candidate and now, because she was critical of tariffs, called it a tax. Now she's pretty much aligning with Trump on the tariffs as it relates to China. I mean, both are trying to control dumping and the undermining of U.S. industries that produce in the United States from China. So you see some agreement there. And so the difference that I hear you say is essentially on the rest of the universal tariffs, right?
Right. And I think also, again, it's hard to see tariffs working in isolation from trade and international relations.
Yeah.
Which I think so, and that's where I think one really has to, it's very hard, at least from our perspective, to look at tariffs in isolation without putting them in context of actually what's happening around the world. Yes, everyone's looking at and having the conversation between the US and China and the impact of tariffs. But then, I've just also mentioned, the role and future role of Mexico in this. And these ideas of this soft decoupling and separation between the US and China. And then you now increasingly have the emergence of what's called these connector economies, these economies that are trying to fill the void and the place between the US and China. So whether that's Mexico, Poland, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So I think it is really important to emphasize the need of, when we have conversations around tariffs, not to have it in isolation away from trade and international relations.
Yeah, and I think the point here is that neither one of them is against trade per se. They're against trade that disfavors, United States manufacturers. They don't want to undercut U.S. jobs is essentially what they're both trying to do, I think, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think both these candidates are in favor of making the US a better place to work and live. They just deploy different mechanisms by which to do that.
Yeah.
And they probably, they obviously deploy different tactics and strategies. They have somewhat different priorities.
Yep.
But it's under this broader umbrella of making the US a better, more secure country in the world.
You mentioned Mexico, and during the next administration, whoever it is, we're going to have a renegotiation of the USMCA agreement. It's up for renewal, and that's the agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Formerly, it was NAFTA. That was renewed last time under the Trump administration. What do you see this time? Do you see would you see another Trump administration doing things differently? And also then, of course, Harris.
Yeah, so under Trump, this move from NAFTA to USMCA obviously came under the Trump administration. I think the realization that Trump will have as they look at renegotiating this is, given, and I mentioned this word earlier, these connector economies, China coming through Mexico to produce products and then distribute them into the US. So Trump versus Harris, Trump will take a much harder line, and let's just say put some more red ink to that agreement than Harris would. I think as Harris looks at altering some of the details in that agreement, she'll look at workers' rights and the environmental implications of some of these changes.
Yeah. Okay, then you have to go over to NATO, as long as we're talking about various things. And there's been this comment out there, or this interpretation from what Trump said, that he wants to pull out of NATO. But when you actually look at what he said, he has not said that. Why don't you clear that up for us?
Yeah, it's more around the funding mechanisms behind NATO, where I think, from Trump's perspective, he feels the US has gone above and beyond for far too long in contributing to this alliance. We've always had, most people know about this 2% target of all NATO countries contributing to that alliance, with the end of making Europe a safer place to live and work and operate. And so I think, to your point, Steve, he's not necessarily against NATO, but I think he is strongly challenging the mechanisms by which countries are paying. And if you look at it, and this 2% target, and whether that 2% target should be 3% or not, there are a lot of European countries that benefit from NATO that are far from hitting that 2%.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what he said. He's very supportive of NATO, but you have some of the member states that are paying less than 1% of their GDP, when in fact they all signed the treaty that said 2% minimum, and they're just not doing it. Now, Harris, of course, has been very supportive of NATO as well, and has said, not she wouldn't go after them rhetorically and publicly, I think, but she has expressed a need for everybody to step up here and support the alliance. Yeah.
Yeah, and she's going to be that way across all alliances. I think you'll see a stronger stance from Harris towards all agreements in terms of bolstering and furthering multilateralism worldwide. Just coming back to the 2%, I think this has come up over the last couple of years in conversation, especially since the Ukraine-Russia war in terms of the future of NATO. How do countries get into it? What is that 2%? Is it realistic? But it's a really fascinating conversation to be had around this target 2%, because the target 2% figure was created quite some time ago. Countries calculate it differently and dispense or spend that 2% differently. And this is one of the conversations I've had for now going on 2 years, is what is the reasoning and rationale behind the 2%? And does that 2% actually make sense in the context of the world that we're now living? And so I think, it is a fair point to be made in terms of challenging numbers and not just taking things at face value and continuing preconceived assumptions around contributions.
We're talking about the economic and geopolitical positions of the two major presidential candidates. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge, from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by David Young, the president of the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board. Okay, so David, we were talking about NATO and the funding mechanisms before the break. Talk about the role of Congress as it relates both to the USMCA and any changes to NATO, because, the presidents have begun to move and act probably more unilaterally, as an executive branch than historically they have. How do you see each candidate embracing or, carrying on in that fashion?
Well, Steve, this goes into one of these points around, you were saying, just presidents having a little bit more unilateral decision-making authority to make things happen. And in the area of tariffs, this is a good example to illustrate what presidents can do with or without the approval and agreement of Congress. So there are several US laws now that give the president broader authority to impose and or reduce tariffs. For instance, and this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, so we're going back some years, that gives the president authority to raise tariffs in cases where imports threaten national security. You've also got Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. So again, going back some decades. And this one gives the president authority to impose retaliatory tariffs if, and I quote, an act, policy, or practice of a foreign country violates or is inconsistent with the provisions of or otherwise denies benefits of the United States under any trade agreement. So you're seeing, and there are some other elements here, but I mentioned these two sections simply because it illustrates that moving forward, well, for the last few years, you're seeing presidents act in a way that is more unilateral with regards to promoting their strategies and their objectives. I think just related here, this broad grant of power lends credibility to the view that a second Trump administration would seek to impose stronger tariffs on imports entering the US, particularly from China. So we mentioned earlier, both candidates are looking at the tariff side, but if one candidate wanted to push them further, there are sections and authorities that potentially allow them to do that.
Yeah. Now, one of the flashpoints you talked about, you didn't say nearshoring, but these pass-through countries. One of the flashpoints, of course, is the southern border. Part of that is the trade aspect of it, but the bigger issue right now is the immigration aspects of it, and in the view that we're seeing a lot of non-controlled immigration coming across the border. Talk about how each of the candidates would deal with the southern border.
Yeah, so from Harris's perspective, just three things to call out. Comprehensive immigration reform would be a needed element that she'll look at prioritizing, in addition to a path to citizenship for immigrants already in the country, and then obviously financial support to the southern border. From Trump's perspective, back to building the wall and securing the southern border, greater funding for support, as well as the conversation around deportation of undocumented immigrants. So again, I think there is recognition from both candidates that the southern border is a significant issue. It is a significant issue that's come up multiple times in their interviews, as well as the one presidential debate that they had. But there will be different tactics and strategies deployed in terms of how they start convincing their voters with regards to how they're going to solve this issue.
Yeah, now an interesting thing is, some of the comments and positions that Harris has taken recently, which kind of diverge from, what the Biden administration has done. She's actually came out and said that she supports finishing the wall, which has not been the Biden policy, and also getting some level of control, and a comprehensive immigration strategy. So there are some differences here in a potential Harris administration versus the Biden administration.
Yeah, Steve, I think this goes to the fact of recognizing where these candidates are currently standing in the polls, what resonates with voters, connecting those two and communicating it effectively to the public. I think the issue of the southern border is seen to be one of the most important issues in this presidential debate. And you're seeing that motivation in her conversations and policy stances. She can't put it this way. Is she going to say, hey, we're going to do less on the southern border than we've done in the last 3.5 years? I'm not really sure that would resonate very well with the voters that she's trying to attract.
Well, and a lot of that is that the view, whether it's right or wrong, but the view that some of those people coming across the border are taking jobs away from citizens, and so you have that tension that's playing into all of this as well. And it's a campaign, so people, the facts sometimes are lost in all of this, but yeah, lots going on here on the southern border. Seems like the key thing. Let's then go back to these geopolitical issues, which you talked about before the break, and of course this is one of them. But we've got three hotspots, at least, but three big ones still, buzzing here: Russia, Ukraine, the China-Taiwan situation, and then of course it seems to be Israel against the world now, or at least their neighbors. Let's just go through each one. And where would Harris differ from Trump, or vice versa, on Russia, Ukraine?
Yeah, and I want to just set the scene here as well for this year, because there's an interesting saying that came out from the UK newspaper, The Guardian, that described 2024 as democracy's Super Bowl. And I know everybody knows the number of elections happening in this year. Is it a year that is unique? If it's not unique, it is extremely rare, because 2024 will not happen again until 2048 by way of numbers. So while the exact numbers do change, as elections aren't always set in stone, or in some cases even known, the numbers are remarkable, perhaps even distracting. So I'll get to these 3 points in just one moment. But earlier this year, we anticipated 83 national elections across 78 countries, with over 4 billion votes to be cast and more than 50% of the world's GDP going to the polls. So again, none of these geopolitical issues and situations are happening in isolation. They're happening within a global ecosystem that is arguably changing more than it has in recent years. So with regards to Russia, Ukraine, and this also kind of connects to the NATO question, Harris will continue what has happened for the last couple of years, the Biden-Harris policies with regards to supporting Ukraine, continued funding. I don't think it's going to go beyond that. What has happened will just simply continue. With regards to Trump, there will be a far greater challenge to why we are doing what we are doing. He said in the presidential debate that he wanted an end to the war. I think we can all agree to that. It's just a matter of how that war is ended and what the end result is. But you'll see a greater challenge from Trump with regards to challenging the money spent on the war and the tactics and actually bringing it to a resolution.
Well, he said, this has got to end. And he said he would negotiate a settlement very quickly, which has been interpreted broadly to mean that he would cede territory. He would argue that Ukraine should cede territory to Russia, that they've, particularly the Donbass region. Is that the way you read it as well?
Potentially, but then my challenge to that would be, how is that going to sit with Ukraine and also Eastern European countries? So I think it is, while that may be Trump's position, I think it's more complicated to that. And I would challenge how well that would sit with Ukrainians. Giving up territory, I think, would be a very, very sensitive issue here. But then again, this conflict, has gone on for some time, and there has to be some resolution brought to it. I mean, we're never going to go back to the way it was simply before. So maybe conceding territory actually, yes, to your point, ends the war and is the best conclusion, while potentially not ideal for Ukrainians.
Okay, talk about the two candidates' position on the China-Taiwan situation.
Yeah.
You've talked about China as being an issue and them wanting to contain China, particularly from a trade standpoint, using tariffs as a tool. But the Taiwan situation is getting dicey.
It's getting dicey, and it's only going to get more dicey. I think what has been interesting, it's almost taken a back seat given not just the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but now emerging and rising tensions in the Middle East. Over the next 4 years, it will be an issue that the president has to address. I think you will see Harris moving closer towards looking at multilateralism approaches and agreements to solving it. I think from Trump's perspective, there's increased skepticism over the benefits of having the US stand up and help Taiwan. You also see different approaches. I was reading something yesterday with regards to Taiwan and this also potentially goes to Trump's personality, a far more transactional approach, where Harris has somewhat more of a systematic approach to foreign affairs. Harris certainly sees Taiwan as protecting American interests and credibility in the international arena. I think both candidates understand the importance of Taiwan, not just between China and Taiwan, but also ramifications and the knock-on effect in the South China Sea. I also think here as well, it very much, and this will kind of take us into what I'm assuming the next conflict will be, which will be Israel. But it's hard to preempt exactly what they're going to do without understanding what China does, when it does it, and how it actually goes about moving towards building more of a unified.
Yeah, but Trump is positioning himself as the one who can contain China, vis-a-vis. But what I hear you saying is that you don't see a lot of daylight. You didn't say this exactly, but I'm hearing, my interpretation of what you said is you don't see a lot of daylight between the policies of the two.
Partly that, because they're not reacting to anything new. China's made their point very clear for years that they want, one unified country, and Taiwan should be part of that. Is it getting dicey? It's getting dicier, and it will only continue to get dicier. But then in the context of everything happening globally, it's potentially one of the less dicey things, especially now when we look at what's happening in the Middle East. So I just think their policies will evolve and emerge over time as they look at what exactly China does.
Okay, so let's go to the Middle East. So obviously, this it looks more and more dangerous every day. What do you think the policy differences? How would you articulate the policy differences as it relates to Israel, as an ally, and also as it relates to any action that they would sanction or take as it relates to Iran and their proxies.
Yeah, so I think both candidates, the underlying theme is this appreciation of supporting allies. But in practice, how that plays out could be very different. You'll see far greater support financially from a Harris administration than you would a Trump administration. I think he would probably make it very clear that Israel needs to solve this situation as soon as possible. Harris, again, agrees it needs to be solved, is very concerned about what's happening. She will continue to emphasize the fact that Israel is an ally and then quickly move on to the humanitarian issues evolving.
Well, she's called for an immediate ceasefire.
Yep.
So she's very consistent with the Biden administration on this issue at least, and negotiate some sort of settlement.
Yep, and I think it's beyond that as well. I think with what's happened in the last week or two on how this conflict is beginning to spread beyond the Gaza-Israel conflict, and now Lebanon, the future role of Iran, what does that mean to wider oil-producing countries? You'll constantly see from a variety of stakeholders the desire to see a calming to the region and a de-escalation of the issue. I think at the moment right now, following the recent attacks, it will be very interesting to see what Israel does now. Do they escalate it further, or do they actually start to de-escalate it?
Okay, but let's also be direct and say that Trump has said that Israel should take out Iran's nuclear capability, and Harris has said just the opposite.
Yeah.
That should not happen, and has sort of protected, and the Biden administration has supported Iran financially and so forth. Again, we don't take positions on this. We're just trying to describe it as as their policy has been described. So this is a big.
Yep.
Whereas there isn't a lot of light between the candidates in some other parts of the world, there is a significant difference here.
Yeah, and you'll see a far more forceful approach and direct approach from Trump in trying to bring about a solution that he thinks is right versus Harris.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and whether that's good or bad is who knows. A lot of what Trump does is he's bellicose, and he comes from everything as a negotiation, and so therefore they don't really know whether he's going to do what he says or not do what he says, but they're afraid of it, so therefore he uses that as power. You see the other side being more traditional in Harris and Biden both have been more traditional with Secretary of State Tony Blinken, with a more I guess traditional diplomatic approach to things. So
yeah, and you'll see that, I think, in conflicts and issues and tensions around the world. This traditionalist diplomatic approach from Harris versus, to your point, Steve, in terms of kind of describing Trump's approach and character, he'll deploy that far more frequently in terms of trying to bring about solutions to tensions and conflicts.
Yeah, very interesting. David Young, thanks for being with us today and helping to define the positions of the two candidates.
A pleasure, Steve. Great to be here. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.